Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. I'm Raymond Kowalski, a truck driver, and most days my work isn't particularly unusual. I usually have a lot on my plate, making sure I deliver the goods on time, taking care of my family, and telling my friends funny stories over a game of poker. Little did I know that soon all of that would be overshadowed by the most terrifying experience of my life. I was hauling a load from Houston, Texas, to Boston, Massachusetts. This was a long and tiresome trip, and I had been traveling for a few days when I finally reached one of those large 24-hour truck stops. I grabbed an energy drink and engaged in some light-hearted banter with the cashier, who laughed while issuing me an unusual warning. Don't approach those nearby woods too closely. People say it's not. It sounded like something you tell kids to keep them away from any potential danger, but it was entertaining nonetheless. That evening, as twilight fell, I decided to park my trailer and take a few hours rest in a nearby motel just off the main highway. After retiring to my room and making calls to loved ones, we exchanged friendly jests, and I waved as I walked back to my truck. The sound of police sirens blasting abruptly jerked me awake in the middle of the night. Drowsy eyes locked on the digital clock next to the bed at 3:13 a.m. had made sure to set my alarm to wake me up before my heavy eyes pulled me into slumber. A dark figure that appeared vaguely humanoid ran out of the chaos and vanished into the woods near the motel with amazing speed. Sensing that something might be amiss, this was much earlier than I had expected for my alarm clock, and I could see it peering outside as showers of menacing red and blue lights reflected on buildings from multiple police cars surrounding an apartment complex across the street. I considered calling for assistance, but the person was wearing a hoodie with a bandana pulled over their face, making it difficult to describe them clearly. In addition, they had already left by morning, and I was ready to move on from this small town tragedy. The sight of those flashing police lights haunted me as much as the lack of sleep while reading the local newspaper. One day, while I was sitting idly on the motel's free television stand, a front-page headline article caught my full attention. It said that a woman had been brutally attacked in her apartment overnight, suffering unspeakable physical and psychological abuse. The image of that shadowy figure from just hours ago running away flashed back into my mind, and a few hours later, I was back on the highway and found myself still thinking about what happened last night. As I drove in the morning, radio hosts were talking about rumors of a brazen and violent self-proclaimed avenger that was rumored to be lurking in our communities. I was listening more intently to what they had to say and trying to piece together what little information I could from them when my truck suddenly swerved as if something had hidden its side, forcing me to keep control and fight to keep the trailer from toppling over completely. As I was about to exit the taxi to look into the situation further, I noticed the man from last night standing only a few feet away through the dusty cabin window air. Knives were gleaming icily under the roadside lamps, and I could clearly see them clutched firmly in my chest, like some uncontrollable beast. I slammed the brakes with reckless force, and my ears reverberated with surreal stillness. The thought of calling for help crossed my mind, but I hesitated because I knew that the hooded figure outside my truck had already shown that he could elude the police, and I couldn't be sure if he intended to target me or if it was just a terrible coincidence. His eyes met mine with a malice I had never felt so afraid of before. Instead, I reached for I raised my phone to record him, and he seemed to notice my movements and started approaching the truck in response to his unexpected advance. I quickly locked the doors, but he stopped a few feet away, staring at me intently as if trying to tell me something. If something terrible happened to me or anyone else in these parts again, at least I would have video evidence to give the authorities to ascertain my intentions, but he abruptly turned away and fled into the neighboring woods. Shaken by this encounter, I called 911 right away to report what had happened. With shaking fingers, I tried to tell them everything that had happened, but then another truck driver arrived and walked over to his car, which was parked next to mine. I slid out of my truck and showed him my recording of the man with the knives. The driver's face went pale as he stared at my screen. "That guy's name is Douglas Sharp," he said in a barely audible whisper, looking around anxiously. "I've seen him before, and everyone thinks he's some kind of avenger seeking justice. But why?" I asked urgently. He asked, "It's rumored that his family was involved in some serious crimes." The driver continued, "A rival gang killed them all, a retaliatory act a few years ago, and now Doug has allegedly taken it upon himself to right those wrongs." I was shocked to hear what I was hearing, so we called for help and waited for the authorities together. It seemed unthinkable that someone could follow such a perverse path and carry out such horrible acts in an attempt to exact revenge, but the more I considered his actions, the more I saw the look of pure hatred in his eyes. The community was on high alert for the next few days, locking their doors and windows and avoiding going outside after gloomy reports of grisly attacks from neighboring towns that were all attributed to Douglas Sharp. However, as time passed, the attacks stopped and an unsettling calm descended upon the area, which the locals fervently hoped would happen. When I opened a text message from an unknown number one morning, after a sleepless night in my truck, I was met with a sickening shock. A picture of my family at our home, with the word justice written beneath it in large, menacing letters. I clung to the hope that perhaps Douglas had changed his mind or had fled somewhere else. Letters of horror made it hard for me to breathe. It seemed like Douglas had somehow figured out my every move and had set his sights on me in my family. Panic struck when I realized that, despite my best efforts to keep him at bay, he had managed to infiltrate my world, and my heart pounded in my ears. I called my family immediately, telling them to look for a gunfight with police officers. That left cornered, Douglas Sharp's reign of terror came to an abrupt end just weeks later. Despite receiving a letter stating that he harbored no ill will towards me, because he recognized that the claims against me were false, they moved as quickly as they could and swiftly agreed to stay safe with real relatives miles away. I am still plagued by the relentless nature of Douglas' pursuit. Was I just a pawn in his twisted game? Or was there a bigger reason he set his sights on me in the icy silence of an endless highway? These are the questions that haunt me even now, even though his menacing presence was unfounded. I'm Raymond, Witherspoon, and as a truck driver, I've seen my share of strange things in this line of work. Today was no exception. I arrived in the heartland of the United States, a remote warehouse in Kansas, which felt very different from the city life I usually lead. The sky had a cold grey hue, and I was adjusting the colour of my jacket to keep the chill at bay. I called out to Carlos Norton, my supervisor for today, from across the parking lot and said, "Hey Ray, how's it hanging, man?" I laughed, but the truth was that I felt exhausted, as if this job was wearing me down both mentally and physically. Carlos was a good guy, and his humour and laid-back manner always managed to lift everyone's spirits. Carlos unlocked the heavy doors, which creaked open to reveal the nearly empty space inside, leaving me wondering what exactly we were here for. The warehouse we were visiting had bolted down its doors for security reasons, which made me uneasy and caused an unexplained knot to form in my stomach. Carlos pointed to a few crates near the back of as we got closer to the enigmatic crates that seemed strangely out of place in such desolation. Something terrible caught our attention, and the odor was so strong that we both gagged. Carlos checked his clipboard for any more information about our cargo when his face went pale, and his breathing became shallow and rapid. He blurted out, I don't know what's in these crates right now, but let's get some information. It only took 15 minutes to load everything onto the truck under the fading sky, and after exerting ourselves twice, we stood beside the truck, gasping for air. A hint of unease lingered in the air, and without saying goodbye, Carlos hurried back to his car in an effort to leave quickly. "Get out of here," he said, with a tone of fear that was both unnerving and perplexing. As I climbed into the driver's seat and turned on the engine, I couldn't help but feel that he knew something I didn't. There was a reason he wanted to leave so quickly. A man startled me by coming out from behind one of the last stacks of crates. He was wearing an old, tattered hat and an oversized, ragged jacket to keep warm, and his face was covered by a long, disheveled beard. But something this bearded stranger, who seemed familiar, studied my truck carefully and silently, taking in every detail. Then, as if on QE, he turned away and disappeared behind the crates without a sound. At that moment, I was reminded of terrifying stories from history, such as serial killers who would methodically stalk their victims, or people who had been kidnapped and never found again. Even though the unease kept growing inside of me like a poisonous vine, I forced myself to shake it off and told myself that what had happened here was nothing to worry about. The drive started out peacefully enough, but those crates were concealing something sinister. It wasn't just baseless paranoia. The man's unnerving was traveling hundreds of miles on this route when something struck the side of my truck with such force that it felt like it had veered me into a ditch. If it had happened a second longer, I would have veered off course, irreparably. My heart raced as if it were trying to burst out of my chest, and panic set in as I gripped the steering wheel. Features haunted my peripheral vision. With white knuckles attempting to regain control, I looked in my side mirror to find the person responsible for this unexpected collision. The familiar bearded man with the weapon behind him was standing on the road behind me, his face expressionless and menacing as he watched the truck lose control while he was working. I decided it was necessary to call for assistance in such a remote location, but my signal was weak. However, pointless frustration accumulated as I was unable to connect and dial the number. The smell of the crates in the back of my truck was overwhelming, creating a sense of urgency that made it best to continue driving while making intermittent attempts to call for assistance. The fear that my life was in danger increased with every mile, fueled by the hideous attacker's silent presence that evening when I pulled into a rural gas station to fill up. I noticed that the smell was getting stronger, almost suffocating. I had to summon the courage to open the crates, despite all of my instincts telling me not to, and when I did, the sight in front of me was heartbreaking. Mutilated human body parts were piled up. The bearded man appeared from the shadows, as if they were a part of him, his face contorting into an unnerving grin as he casually lifted a crowbar in his hand and swung down toward me with a grotesque jigsaw puzzle of limbs that had been brutally torn apart from their owners. I felt my stomach lurch, but I didn't have time to think about the horror, brutality and lethal accuracy. But because of my growing paranoia, I managed to dodge his attack in time. The crowbar hit the ground with a sickening thud, and the head of its intended target struck my skull. There was a spooky silence between us as we carefully considered each other's next moves, and neither of us was willing to reveal our strategies so soon until the gas station attendant broke free from our deathly trance-like state. I heard the attendant say, "Hey, that's Harrison Merrick. He's been killing people for months." When the police realized what was happening, I took advantage of a momentary distraction to get away, and I drove off in my truck with the hideous contents still in tow. I called the police and gave them all the details. The pursuit lasted 4 days, from the license plate to the unspeakable horror in those crates. Harrison was aware that I was speaking with law enforcement and was committed to stopping me by any means necessary. As night fell, we both navigated through hazardous terrain and obstacles, and once again, protected by my surroundings, I pulled over to plan how to visit justice. As I struggled with possible outcomes, I felt hopeless because there seemed to be no way to defeat this vicious adversary without losing him or myself. Harrison Merck proved to be incredibly clever and persistent, making any attempt to capture him nearly impossible. He managed to evade capture while leaving a trail of death and chaos wherever he appeared. And it was evident that his bloodlust and horrible crimes were far from being satisfied. My final thoughts were about the victims, all the lost souls that this vicious monster had mutilated and butchered. Harrison Merrick may have passed away for the time being, but his eerie smile and haunting visage will always be etched in my memory. My resolve was unwavering, and I felt uneasy. This was not the end, though. I'm Kermit Fry, a simple man with simple pleasures who occasionally indulges in a drink after long hours of driving on this lonely profession. It started on a typical Monday morning when I got into my old rusty truck, ready to travel and move some merchandise across the state of Montana. I chose to take advantage of my break, our remote rest stop tucked away between the picturesque trees on this particular day, because traffic seemed less crowded than usual, and there weren't many other truckers joking sarcastically on the CB radio. As I strolled through the parking lot, I noticed something odd going on near one of the other parked trucks. Someone was carefully applying duct tape to its exhaust pipe. The person appeared nervous and unsure of themselves, which made me uneasy. As I approached, I realized that this was no harmless practical joke. A moment later, the person saw me and fled into the nearby wooded area. Uneasy about this unexpected incident, however, I didn't have enough evidence to call for assistance, so I decided not to pursue them, and simply reported the incident to our dispatch support center, not realizing that it was only a prelude to what lay ahead of me in the next few hours. As night fell, I continued traveling through twisting roads encircled by thick forests, lulled by the monotonous hum of my truck's engine. The only thing keeping me from SL lumbering abruptly halting my progress was the beam from my headlights, piercing into ever more dangling shadows. A shadowy figure was clinging to my truck with great strength, one muscular hand gripping tightly onto its edge. I panicked but dared not slam down on the brakes, knowing full well the disastrous consequences. So I swerved abruptly. Delirium was an unusual noise mixed with the familiar sounds of tires crushing gravel and thudding footsteps from behind my trailer. To throw them off balance as my truck jerked violently from the maneuver, I heard a sharp hiss, and my heart was still pounding. In my chest, I pressed the gas pedal harder, and my tires screeched against the pavement as I sped through desolate areas and dimly lit towns that were now encased in night's eerie embrace. The silent figure, disturbingly calm, clung tenaciously to my vehicle, to my chest. As we got closer to a town that I knew had some police presence, the figure abruptly let go and vanished into the night. I was breathing heavily and my heart was racing, but I felt a sense of safety for the first time, even though it was only a delusion, because there was no evidence of these horrible events, and I tried till my senses were sharpened after the terrifying events of last night, when the radio whispered reports of a string of vicious attacks with victims left dead or worse. I tried my best to convince myself that it was just a strange fluke, but the following morning I anxiously resumed my journey and wondered if the mysterious figure was connected to these violent incidents traversing the roads with. I was cautious and watched other cars and my surroundings. At one point, I saw a fellow trucker named Harold pull over to check his car. Since we had already met, I decided to stop and help him by sharing my suspicions about the unidentified person and how it might be related to recent attacks. Harold listened carefully. "Kermit," and he said gravely, "I believe I heard rumors about someone matching that description." Nodding gravely, we decided that we both needed to take extra precautions for the remainder of the day. Jackknife Joe is a menace with unusual strength and brutality, and his reputation continued to fuel whispers of fear in every town I passed through. Eventually, night fell again, and the darkness outside grew thicker and more impenetrable with each mile covered. Our journey continued down a seemingly endless stretch of road, and as I struggled to remain vigilant, I was startled awake by the familiar footsteps behind me. My eyes were wide open in terror once more, and I realized that Jackknife Joe had returned. Desperation took over when it occurred to me that maybe I could record this sinister fiend's actions so that authorities could finally put an end to his grisly reign. I stealthily took out my phone's camera and attempted to record what was happening behind me, carefully controlling my speed and steering the truck to keep it stable even on uneven terrain. The video showed Jackknife Joe clinging to my truck, like before, his face cruel and his movements precise and effective. His ruthless mask gave off an eerie vibe, and I couldn't help but shudder at the gory mess he had left in his wake. Deciding it was time to end this horrific experience that was acting as living bait, I drove my truck toward the last town had passed through, a location with a high police presence. I knew the risk, but I thought it would be worth it to catch Jackknife Joe. The chase was unsettling, and my heart was racing as I got closer to the town, making sure Joel was still pursuing me. I pulled into a well-lit gas station with patrons and police nearby. As planned, they noticed us right away and started to encroach on Jackknife Joe. Suddenly realizing the danger, Joe gave me a menacing smile before jumping off my truck and running at breakneck speed in the direction of the surrounding darkness. The police gave chase a look, but ultimately came away empty-handed. After that terrifying encounter, footage of Jackknife Joe spread among authorities and the media. While I was lucky to escape relatively unharmed, countless others were not. As for Jackknife Joe, he's still at large and remains a vicious killer who could reappear at any time, anywhere, bringing terror with him. Those who have survived him can only hope that justice will eventually stand up to this terrifying character, or fate will finally catch up with him. But in the meantime, there will always be whispers of danger lurking in the shadows of dark roads. I was taking a deep breath and enjoying the freedom of being out on the open road when everything went strange. My name is Porter Fallen, and I drive a truck and have traveled all over the United States on a typical day. I had stopped for a quick bite at an old diner just outside of Helena on a remote stretch of highway in Montana, but as I would soon discover, this day turned out to be anything but typical. As I chewed on my burger, I heard two locals discussing a string of odd incidents that had been occurring in the area recently. It wasn't my business, but I found their conversation to be interesting. After eating, I kept driving to my next destination, but soon after, I noticed someone unfamiliar driving at me. At first, I assumed it was just someone speeding, but after some time on the road with them and several chances for it to leave or pass me by, I became more suspicious. I considered calling for assistance, but I reasoned that I must be paranoid, that nothing ever happens to people like me. I gradually ran out of rational reasons why this car might still be following me, which made me worrying. As darkness drew closer and shadows engulfed the last of the daylight, I realized that, despite my best attempts to dispel them with erratic turns and varied speed changes, the car continued to follow me closely without ever attempting to overtake me or pull off onto another road. The tension in the air grew, my anxiety grew with every mile we traveled together. Suddenly, out of the blue, the car sped up and violently sideswiped my truck. The impact was so severe that I thankfully managed to regain control of my truck, with only minor injuries. In that eerie silence, I was understandably shaken, because the car had stopped close by and for a moment, nothing moved until the driver appeared. He was tall, unusually so, and wore a long, trench coat that seemed to flap slowly as he approached. His face was hidden by shadows, and I couldn't make out any of his features at all. In his hand, he held something sharp and reflective, possibly. The truck lurched forward, veering straight towards my assailant with terrifying speed. The man stepped off to the side, but not before barely escaping being crushed beneath the weight of my vehicle without any protection. I knew I had to do something, so I pressed down on the accelerator as hard as I could with my heart hammering in my chest. I have no idea how or why this man targeted me, but I knew that, if we kept going in this direction, I would have survived for a long time, so I drove faster and more erratically than ever before in an effort to shake him off. As Assailant got back into his car and the chase went on, I finally noticed another truck stopped up ahead. This was my last hope that someone would be there to help me. I breathed a little sigh of relief as I pulled into the truck stop, because there were some people milling around, and I hoped that they might act as witnesses or even offer some support if things got worse. I parked my truck and watched as the strange car slowly rolled to a stop close by. The driver emerged again, just as tall and shadowy as before, but this time he was holding what seemed to with all eyes on me now, and an unwavering fear of looking foolish or overreacting in front of these strangers driving my actions. I decided to go with plan B as a small hatchet. My brain was screaming for me to call for help, but something kept stopping me. The more I thought about it, the more unsure and embarrassed I felt about explaining my situation. After all, what concrete proof did I have that this man meant me any harm? Tried to keep my voice steady as I spoke to a trucker who had stopped for their break about his day. My new acquaintance seemed amused by our conversation, but she complied with my request. Soon after, another trucker joined us, a woman named Sandra. From her exhausted expression, she gave a first-hand account of the man in question, whose name was Malcolm, and whose actions had long been viewed with suspicion. By Sandra claims that members of the local community claim that Malcolm has terrorized people ever since he arrived in town a few months ago without any explanation. He has done this by choosing to stalk drivers, especially truckers like us, before brutally attacking them. Several victims have already confirmed Malcolm's particularly unsettling tactics, which was grim confirmation of everything I had suspected since our paths first crossed earlier that day. Knowing without a doubt the danger, Sandra and I swiftly rallied those around us and sought safety in numbers by pushing together the tables and chairs that were typically reserved for more leisurely breaks after this man posed. The following hour passed in a state of intense anticipation, even though we protected him from apparent safety within our makeshift barricade. Malcolm continued to stalk the truck stop's perimeter. At one point, he swung his weapon at an empty gas pump, leaving a nasty gash that served as a stark reminder of his intentions. We thought about driving away, but there was always the risk that we'd be left on the road alone, vulnerable to his ferocity once again. As night fell, he was unfazed by our collective presence and determined to ward him off. Felt as though there was little hope for escape. And then, after what seemed like an eternity, Malcolm appeared weary of this game of cat and mouse. He abruptly withdrew back to his car and drove slowly away into the surrounding darkness, even as we exchanged strange smiles with those around us in a supposed victory. Despite this, I couldn't get rid of the uneasy feeling that came over me, and our narrow escape was little comfort. Malcolm was still free to carry on his twisted reign, and not even my truck, which is typically a symbol of freedom and adventure, could provide me with genuine comfort from this knowledge. The open road ahead is now marred by the terrifying reminder that I have unknowingly been exposed to Malcolm's terrible world, never knowing what horrors might continue to unfold beyond my line of sight. Concluding when I think back on what happened today, I can't help but wonder how many other drivers, like me, might be terrified for their lives before Malcolm's story ends abruptly or, better yet, satisfyingly. Until justice is served, all we can do is hope that people won't come across such a cruel and sinister person while traveling the unpredictable roads of life. As I parked my truck at a truck stop on the outskirts of Amarillo, Texas, I noticed the tapping on the window. My name is Patrick Callahan, and I'm just a regular guy who happened to have fallen into the truck driving profession by accident. I needed to stretch my legs and get some food before sleeping in my little cocoon, which was the only place where I felt cozy and at ease while operating my 18-wheeler. "What's up, Bruce?" I called out. Bruce Kenty, a fellow trucker, came up to my window. He was one of those people you see everywhere, but never really get to know beyond small talk. He asked, "There's that escaped convict making his way through these parts," and his eyes widened before he continued. "No, I didn't catch any news lately," he said. Bruce looked around anxiously before lowering his voice and gouging out his victim's eyes with his bare hands. "It's like a sick calling card." I looked sideways at him and laughed. "Man, I'm not going to let some psycho ruin a decent meal." With that assurance, we went inside together for dinner as we ate our hamburgers, and Widowmaker, who has been on some sort of killing spree across multiple states ever since he broke out of that high-security prison. Silently, I couldn't help but check the front door every few minutes, feeling a little more suspicious than before. But nothing seemed unusual tonight, just regular people coming and going for their late-night snacks. After I finished eating, I excused myself from the table and walked down a dimly lit hallway to the restrooms, where I washed my hands. I was in a hurry and happened to look in the mirror when I noticed a tall figure in a bloody tartar jumpsuit standing behind me. Panic struck, my heart racing, and I rushed for the bathroom door to get out of the Widowmaker's grasp. Just as I barely managed to get away from his strong hold, I ran back towards Bruce in the main area, screaming at the top of my lungs as chaos erupted around us. A waitress attempted to barricade herself inside a storage room with only a few other people nearby. She screamed out in genuine terror, her words clouded by fear, and someone dialed their cell phone. Bruce and a small group of patrons stared in shock, and a few got up to confront the menacing figure who was following closely behind me. We all huddled together with shaking hands, seeking refuge from the horror that would inevitably follow. We held our breath in unnerving anticipation as we heard footsteps echoing toward our hiding place. Suddenly, everything changed to a deafening cacophony of screams mixed with the horrifying sounds of flesh being torn apart. I found it difficult to remain calm, and we all teetered on the edge of our seats. The sound of sirens in the distance indicated that help was finally on its way, but would they arrive in time to save us, or would they encounter another terrifying situation? We waited helplessly for what felt like an eternity in the midst of the blood-curdling chaos outside of reality, and reality slipped even further away from my grasp, leaving me reeling in disbelief at the horrific acts of terror occurring before my very eyes. Crime scene. As time went on, we became more tense as we prepared for whatever fate had in store. The Widowmaker's footsteps became louder and more deliberate, and he taunted us by tapping his nails against the wall. My heart raced inside its cage, and cold, clammy sweat ran down my spine. Suddenly, the door burst open, and in nothing about the Widowmaker's appearance revealed his origins or motivations. We tried to make ourselves appear smaller in the hopes that our futile attempt at hiding would protect us from what we knew was coming. Desperate to survive, the Widowmaker himself stepped out, tall and imposing, blood smearing across his face and jumpsuit, his dark eyes darting around the room sizing up his victims. The police eventually arrived on the scene, but our hopes were quickly dashed when they entered the main area and found themselves facing this relentless killer who somehow managed to evade capture with brutal methods. Some people started attacking him with whatever they could find, including chairs, mops, and broken glass from shattered windows. But these attempts only served to slow him down for a few seconds. Efficiency I knew that any longer waiting in the storage room would not change our fate, so I made the decision to take matters into my own hands. I whispered urgently to the others that if we were to have any chance of survival, we needed to move. Although most of them initially hesitated, we finally crept out of our hiding place as quietly as possible when we heard gunshots, which meant that the police were diverting Widowmaker long enough for us to survive. We hurried to the exit, doing everything we could to keep him from learning of our escape plan. My heart was racing so much that I was having trouble breathing, and every time I took a step forward, fear took over. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream reverberated through the hallway behind us, and the heartbreaking sound almost made me give up and collapse there, helpless and sick with despair. The fact that others had fallen victim to the Widowmaker's wrath weighed heavily on us, but we refused to let it stop us. We continued to move in the hope that we wouldn't run into the monster until we eventually emerged through the exit and into the chilly night air. Far from the immediate threat, we hid behind parked trucks and kept in constant communication with 911, keeping them informed of our whereabouts and asking them to send reinforcements. A police officer came up to us in a low voice, clearly trying to avoid the Widowmaker's attention. We told him what had happened inside, and he quickly updated his fellow officers via a walkie-talkie. A few moments later, a news van pulled up at the scene, providing live coverage to the world. I asked the officer, "Who is this guy?" As more police and media flocked to the scene, it became clear to me that this experience would be permanently etched in my memory for years to come. We watched as SWAT teams surrounded the building. The officer, Raymond Ray Bakerfield, quietly told me that he has been on a rampage since being released on parole. The man demonstrates remarkable intelligence and brutality. Marker would become well known throughout the nation for his horrifying deeds that transpired in Amarillo to our collective horror and incredulity. A moment later, a terrifying scene appeared from inside. Widowmaker was able to elude the responding forces with shocking speed and agility, sprinting out of sight in a matter of seconds, leaving only carnage in his wake. The hunt for him started anew after our near-death experience. I feared what might happen next. I knew that tonight would haunt me for years to come, but worse, I knew that he was still out there, waiting to terrorize another innocent person. My name is Garrison Hendrick, and I work as a truck driver. People often think that my line of work is boring and repetitive. However, truck drivers frequently make up their own little adventures to keep themselves entertained. Little did I know that I would soon find myself in a real-life nightmare that would turn out to be far more terrifying than any adventure I had ever imagined. It all started when I was making a stop at a dilapidated convenience store for gas and some snacks during one of my regular runs through Los Cruces, New Mexico, when I noticed an elderly woman with I tried to start a conversation by asking her if everything was okay, but to my surprise, she responded with a terrified and urgent tone. "You need to watch out around here," she said, warning that someone was watching and waiting. She had a frantic expression on her face and kept looking around anxiously as if she was being watched. As I reluctantly departed to continue my journey, I couldn't help but notice the hairs on the back of my neck, which made me think that perhaps she wasn't okay, and that her sanity was being eaten away by fear or confusion. The sun sank below the horizon as I continued to cross the desert Highway 70, an empty stretch of night in New Mexico, where my thoughts were interrupted by the crackle of my CB radio, which caught me off guard when a deep voice began speaking. It sounded distorted and disturbingly inhuman, so I instinctively turned it off. However, tonight it seemed like there was an additional unease, the oppressive sensation that even with the radio turned up full blast, something sinister lingered just out of sight. As the night went on, the loneliness only got worse and the atmosphere seemed to get heavier with every mile. Suddenly, in the distance, I saw a car that appeared to be abandoned on the side of the road, its lone headlight slicing through the darkness with an unnatural intensity. Unable to tap down my nerves. Could this be what that woman was talking about? The steady hum of my truck's idling engine felt like a lifeline as I cautiously approached it out of curiosity. However, upon closer inspection, I discovered an unsettling sight, a trail of what appeared to be blood leading from the driver's seat and into the desert, disappearing into obscurity among the sagebrush and mesquite. In any reasonable situation, I could have turned around at that very moment, but something pushed me forward into the night of the desert, an inexplicable force. As I staggered blindly through and thorny plants that stung my legs, I gradually became aware of a disquieting sound, a faint scream that was either carried on the wind or maybe just in my head, but I was unable to get rid of it or shake it off. Ignoring it, the sound grew louder and began to close in on me, and I had the unmistakable feeling that someone or something was right behind me. The thought turned into reality when a figure appeared in front of me, and his insane eyes were fixed on mine the entire time. I didn't realize that my body had kicked him out of instinct and fled back towards my truck, feeling fear rising. Inspiration urged me to reach inside the truck for anything that can be used for defense against him before he catches up again. As I frantically searched for a weapon inside the truck, I found a tire iron in the storage compartment and gripped it tightly as I braced myself for the worst. Adrenaline rushed through every inch of my body, hurting nothing but the unsightly snickers behind me. Knowing that help was miles away on this lonely stretch of highway, I chose not to call for a help, instead of holding onto the heavy tire iron and trying to regain some semblance of control over my fear as I peeked out, as the laughter grew louder and closer with every second, filling me with dread and a deep urgency to put distance between this man and myself. The twisted figure disappeared from behind the car like a terrifying phantom into the night. Since I had no time to waste, I got back in my truck and pressed the gas pedal while driving quickly down the road. Sweat started to form on my brow, but I didn't say a word. As night turned to day, there was no more sign of that sinister figure. Along when I got to the next truck stop, I started talking to an old-timer who had seen a lot of desolate highways. After listening to my terrifying story in agonizing detail, he gravely told me about Martin Sinclair, a man suspected of committing a string of horrific killings and mutilations along this exact stretch of road. My heart was pounding again when I realized that this man must have been near enough to call me on my CB radio during our terrifying encounter. Martin Sinclair had left a trail of death in his wake, and now there was no doubting that he had focused his evil gaze on me, even though I knew the grim reality of the enigmatic figure on Highway 70. Nothing more happened during the remainder of my trip, and months went by without any problems as my life resumed its normal routine until Martin Sinclair had not stopped his reign of terror, and perhaps never would have. He seemed to strike at will with motives known only to himself. Perhaps it was just a perverse game he played for his sick amusement every time I drove down those roads. That fateful day, I discovered bloodstains on the door of my truck cab that were indistinguishable from those that haunted me in Lost Cruise. Undoubtedly, it took control of my entire being and left me wondering if I would be his next victim. The story ends with more questions than answers, because I couldn't stop thinking that Martin could be watching me at any time. Every headlight shadow and faint rustle in the darkness rekindled my trauma and increased my paranoia. I am Connor Beckett, a truck driver from the small town of Autumn Bay in California. I'm acutely aware that someone like Martin Sinclair is always out there lurking in waiting for their next prey to cross their twisted path. As long days spent driving through arid landscapes blur into ever longer nights filled with haunting thoughts, a predator eludes capture while continuing to torment innocent souls trying to carry on with their lives. As much as I hate to admit it, I'm a little skeptical of the odd and unusual in Maine. Trucker life can be quite unpredictable, funny, frustrating, and never boring, like the time a deer tried to steal my lunch last month while I was driving through the state. Don't worry, the deer was fine with my lunch. On my usual route through Wisconsin, I came across a diner that seemed out of place among the vast farmland. The closest city was miles away, but this tiny, retro-style diner sat there like an island of civilization in the middle of nowhere. I stopped because I had skipped breakfast and could feel my stomach rumbling loudly, and it felt like I was going back in time. The waitress greeted me with a humorous smile, saying, "You look like a guy who missed breakfast." As I savored the best burger I've ever had at any diner, I noticed something odd, a wall covered in newspaper clippings about missing people. What really struck me was how similar the victims were all truck drivers, disappeared while traveling. Suddenly, Out of the corner of my eye, I saw someone moving behind the line of bushes outside. It was difficult to see any details at this distance, but they appeared to be completely covered in a viscous liquid. Curiosity seized me, and I went outside to take a closer look, but there was no sign of anyone or, for that matter, no bloody person. That there was a lingering smell that made me think of rusty metal, like blood, but there was no obvious source. The discomfort of what had happened started to set in. I started to wonder if the person involved in the crime had committed a crime, or if I had seen something inappropriate, but I was so shaken by the encounter that I chose to get back in my truck and drive as far away from that diner as I could 4 hours on end, because I couldn't get the smell out of my head. Strange encounter, tired and restless, I pulled into a truck stop for the night and tried to sleep, but as I was about to doze off, a tap on the window startled me, and I felt a chill run down my spine when I saw a face outside, the same face, covered in the red and brown liquid from earlier, with sweat streaming down my face and fear gripping my body. My trembling hands took off as the figure outside banged on my window as I fumbled for my phone, startling me with each blow. Panicked, I found my phone and dialed 911, trying to stay calm, but finding it impossible as the figure pounded on my window, causing my frantic breathing to turn into soft gasps. The 911 operator reassured me that help was on its way and told me to stay on the line, but feeling helpless and trapped in my truck, I lost control of my rational thinking. In a desperate attempt to protect myself and confront the threat, I opened the door and hurried to the truck stop building, but before I could get there, a figure grabbed my arm, and as we struggled, I could see more of his face. He appeared to have spent a lifetime inflicting harm, as evidenced by the obvious old blood and dried skin patches hanging from his cheeks. With my free hand, I was able to grab a wrench from a nearby toolbox and swing it towards the figure's knee, landing a blow that sent him to the ground. Without wasting any more time, I ran inside the building and locked myself in an empty storage room. Outside, I could hear him mumbling softly, as if he were reciting the names of his victims. If my suspicions were right, some truck drivers heard the disturbance and came inside to find out who was causing it. Things got out of control as people rushed to my aid and confronted the bloody man. In a surprising turn of events, one of the truckers, who had experience in forensics, recognized the man and knew his name was Cyrus Newman. The truckers reported Cyrus' location to law enforcement as they repelled Cyrus' retaliation, which focused on their eyes with unnerving precision, as if he knew this would be their final strike before retreating when they least expected it. Prior to his disappearance, Cyrus was a notorious hitman wanted by several states for his horrific crimes against innocent people. In recent years, however, he had gained notoriety for attacking people who crossed his path along remote highways. After a few days, my skepticism was replaced by genuine fear for my life and the lives of others in my profession. The sun rose as officers and detectives cleaned up the scene, but Cyrus was ultimately unsuccessful and managed to disappear into the night before law enforcement arrived, leaving behind an uncanny sense of emptiness. Newspaper clippings detailing Cyrus's numerous transgressions against truck drivers, including myself, were crammed into their files. As I was about to leave the truck stop, whispers surrounded me, sharing their terrifying yet somehow captivating theories about Cyrus, idol and confidant, a monstrous creature with a penchant for such gory, shocking results. The knowledge that Cyrus Newman was in the shadows sent a chill down my spine. Fear would undoubtedly continue to haunt every driver who took to the roads at night, so it seemed wise to replace skepticism with anger. He had retreated from our encounter, but he had not suffered a loss. My newfound peers and I came to this realization together, bound by our shared experience, and noting his victims' unknown faces connected by their shared occupation. As a truck driver named Harlan Fassett, I've had my share of weird experiences on the road, but this small Midwestern town was by far the creepiest. I was alert and constantly on the lookout for any indications of Cyrus' return. It was an exceptionally chilly evening for autumn in Baxter, Iowa. After hours of driving, I was eager for a hot meal and a strong cup of coffee when I pulled up to the nearly deserted truck stop. The fluorescent lights of the diner welcomed me like a moth to a flame, and as soon as I stepped inside, I couldn't help but laugh at an odd bumper sticker on one of the booths that said, "Honk if you love necromancers." Looking back, perhaps this should have been more of a warning than a light-hearted joke. My boots were scuffed. "We don't get many visitors around here," she said curiously, "so it seems like that would make business difficult." I joked, trying to keep it light, and she responded with a chuckle. As I waited for my food, I noticed that Penelope, the short-tempered waitress, had thrown me a half-hearted smile as she poured my coffee along the linoleum floor. As I took my first bite of heart-attack-inducing food, the bell above the door tingled. Softly, another man wandered into the diner, looking disheveled and covered in filth, with oily hair hanging low. It was not surprising that there were no customers around, but it still gave the place an eerie vibe. Moments after my burger arrived, Penelope was gone from sight again, leaving me alone in this roadside oasis. I felt sick to my stomach as I tried to find out what was causing my anxiety outside. But there seemed to be nothing I missed. He didn't order anything, just shuffled over to a table near the back and occasionally shot me eerie glances before staring out into the dark parking lot. His face was ghostly pale, with dark circles under his bloodshot eyes. Kicked him because I hurriedly finished my meal, leaving money on the table, and ran off towards my rig, not even noticing Penelope's quiet laughter echoing far behind me. Once I was back inside my truck, I turned on the engine and made sure my cargo was secure. Minutes went by without any problems, but it seemed like something wasn't right with every breath I took, which is when I saw the stranger from the diner again. He was strolling slowly, with a grin on his hideous face and my heart pounding. I slammed on the gas and roared out of the truck as quickly as I could in an attempt to put some distance between me and that unsettling man. Every fiber in my body told me something about him was seriously damaged, and the rearview mirror didn't provide any comfort. It only showed a nightmare stalking me like despite flooring it. His figure remained in view for what appeared to be hours until abruptly he vanished into shadows that hadn't been there a second ago. After escaping the truck stop in Baxter, Iowa, and losing sight of the stranger, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that even though he wasn't running or shouting, he was smiling as if amused by my growing terror. He wasn't even human. I parked my rig outside the small, unremarkable building and walked nervously toward the entrance. Inside, I found the sheriff sitting behind a cluttered desk, idly sipping on a coffee mug. He looked up curiously as I approached, and I decided to visit the local sheriff's office in hopes of learning more about this mysterious man. The sheriff raised an eyebrow and then slowly wiped his mouth with a napkin. "Oh, and what exactly about? This person struck you as odd." I described my experience at the truck stop, explaining my name's Heron Fassett. I said hesitantly, "Well, this may sound strange, but there was someone at the truck stop tonight that just didn't seem right." The stranger in great detail, including his eerie presence, dirty appearance, and unsettling smile. As I told the sheriff about him, I noticed that his expression grew more grim. After I finished, he nodded slowly and reluctantly and revealed that there had been multiple horrific attacks on travelers in the previous few days. All of them shared a description of a man who matched the stranger from earlier. They call him Randall Breyer. "I've lived in this area for a long time," and he said solemnly that nobody knows much about his background or origins other than his name, even though most people try to avoid him. As unnerving as it was to hear, I felt somewhat relieved that I hadn't miscalculated my feelings about this man or whatever he is. He warned me not to drive alone in Baxter at night before I left the sheriff's office and headed back to my rig. His warning echoed in my ears as I tried to ignore my fear, but I couldn't help but feel that this was far from over. I drove for several miles before deciding to pull over for a short break at a slightly different location. Busier truck stop. I lay in my sleeper berth attempting to get some sleep that night. The thought of Randall Breyer kept coming back to me, and my anxiety made it almost impossible for me to fall asleep. My heart was thumping in my chest as I cautiously peered through the window, searching the area for any indication of what caused my breath cause when I saw Randall Breyer, again, standing a few feet from my truck. At that moment, I realized that no one was close enough to call for assistance. And why would anyone believe me about this seemingly inexplicable phenomenon if they could hear me at all? The wind howled around him, seemingly sharing his evil intentions. In addition, I turned on my rig's engine and blasted out of the truck stop once more, leaving behind Randall Breyer's demonic gaze. Even now, after traveling on innumerable highways and coming across countless truck stops, people can never forget that eerie encounter in Baxter. It serves as a constant reminder that some threats in this world are real and are always waiting for their next victim. Somewhere out there, Baxter or Randall Breyer is still smiling somewhere. My name is Archibald O'Connor, but people call me Archie. I drive a truck and have traveled across the United States more times than I can remember. One part of my job that I enjoy is the chance to visit lesser-known American towns. On one such occasion, I went through Grimesville, a small, unremarkable town. I was carrying a load of supplies from the East Coast, and it was around midnight when I pulled into Grimesville. I was so tired that I decided to eat at the local diner before finding a place to park for the night. As I entered, I met the eyes of an odd man who was sitting at the far end of the diner. He was a disheveled man. Although I noticed him right away when I walked into the diner, the man didn't seem particularly noteworthy until something bizarre caught my attention. He was maybe 63 years old, had unkempt facial hair, wore a dirty beige overcoat, and every time he moved in his seat, he emitted a strong odor that drifted towards me. In one quick motion, he subtly slid what appeared to be a black trash bag under his table with so much. There are a lot of strange things that happen all over this country, and I've learned to not worrying about other people's problems and to shrug off the strangeness of it all. I took a seat at the counter and ordered a burger and fries from Marilyn, the chatty waitress. She asked me if I was okay, and I said, "Oh, it's nothing," with a hesitant smile, and nodded at the strange man, wondering about that guy. Marilyn cautiously leaned in and whispered, "Yeah, he comes in here quite often at night. We're not supposed to feed him or anything, but sometimes I sneak him something small knowing he doesn't have much." As I grudgingly ate my meal, my phone started ringing, and it was my brother Vincent. We started talking about the typical family topics. As our conversation came to an end, we heard a loud thud coming from behind us. The strange man had unintentionally knocked out the trash bag from under his table in his hurry to leave the diner, and as he rushed to pick it up and head for the exit, something fell out of the bag, something so disgusting and horrible that I almost choked on my food and blood. The diner was filled with panic, and I knew I had to take action, so I hastily ended my brother's phone call saying, a drenched lump of meat that looked like a human hand rolled onto the floor. Eyes widened, and we all stared at it for a moment, in complete shock and disbelief before anyone could act or react. "Something's happened, Vincent. I'll call you back." I hung up and examined the terrified faces around me. Not wanting to waste any more time, I acted without thinking about how tired I was. I left the diner and looked for any sign of the strange man. The streets of Grimesville were dimly lit at this hour, but a faint trail of blood gave me his location, so I started to follow it, and soon discovered that it wouldn't be as simple as I had hoped. It appeared that he had taken a zigzag route throughout the town. Fortunately, a police officer on night patrol happened to cross my path. I told him what had happened in the diner as discreetly as possible, and he recorded it for backup and recommended that we carry on our search futilely. Cautiously made our way through the empty streets, and after almost an hour of searching for clues and dead ends, We finally arrived in a warehouse district by the river. The officer had heard about a suspicious man, Jeremiah Flint, who occasionally appeared in the area. We divided up to cover more ground, but we were still within earshot of one another when there was a sudden yelp, echoed through the night air from my partner's direction. I was alarmed, but I didn't want to put myself or others in danger by yelling aloud, so I followed the sound without sounding the alarm. My intuition took me to a remote alcove behind one of the warehouses, where the police officer was lying, on the ground with his throat slashed open with gory precision. The grisly sight made me doubt my investigation, and it was clear that I had found something evil and dangerous lurking within Grimesville. Cornered and cautious, Jeremiah Flint's blood-soaked overcoat finally emerged from the darkness as I approached the river's edge. I chose not to call for help at this point because I knew it would put more people in danger. Instead, I gripped my phone in one hand and a piece of broken pipe in the other. The man with the trash bag full of terrifying secrets could not be stopped because he was beyond all assistance and reason. His actions were driven by a monster and an uncontrollable, unfathomable urge for violence that could not be controlled or understood. As I looked into his cold eyes, I realized that doing anything other than leaving Grimesville right away would only lead to more senseless and horrific deaths. I backed away from the edge and nodded in recognition of this horrifying reality. Jeremiah Flint smiled eerily before vanishing into the shadowy depths of his twisted world. I knew that no matter how hard I tried to find answers or justice for those unfortunate souls who came into contact with him, there would only be more victims entangled in his web of horror. I went back to my truck. Haunted by the sun crept up as I left Grimesville behind, knowing that no matter how far away or safe I felt in my travels, Jeremiah Flint's bloody touch would forever mar my memory, never to be forgotten. Within the shadows of America's forgotten towns, there were unspeakable evils, like Jeremiah Flint waiting to pounce, and I felt an overwhelming resignation about what had happened and worried about what might lie ahead, completely forgotten from my mind. My name is Alton Whitaker, and I work as a truck driver for a large distributor in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Most people despise my line of work, but when Thanksgiving rolls around and they're stuffing their faces with turkey, they should remember that they need men like me to deliver it to them. Encounter a variety of people, but I want to share with you one instance where things became absolutely terrifying. It was a typical day, or the equivalent of a truck driver's day, when I was delivering parts for a computer store or something in Denver. They were running late, so in order to avoid the traffic, it was really exhausting to travel through the night as around 2 in the morning. I chose to stop at a rest area close to some woods and get some coffee. As I emerged from the vehicle, a cool breeze and an odd stench swept over me. I decided not to assume the worst about strangers these days, so I tried my best to ignore this somewhat disheveled guy in the distance who was standing there with his eyes on me. He was tall and wore tattered clothes covered in stains that looked like more than just dirt. It smelled different from anything I had ever encountered before, almost putrid, but oddly floral at the same time. When things took a turn for the worse, I grabbed my coffee and started to head back to my rig. Before I knew what was happening, a guy appeared right behind me and put his iron grip hand on my shoulder. I tried to sound less scared and more light-hearted, but is that a new handshake they're teaching out here? The stranger didn't even bother to respond. Instead, he just gave me a sickening smile that showed me what was left of his teeth, which were rotten and covered in dried blood. I felt a wave of dread and knew that I needed to use every last bit of strength I had to escape. So I jerked out of his grasp and ran for my rig, my heart racing as I scurried inside and slammed the door shut. I started the engine as quickly as I could, but just as I was about to press the metal, the man threw his body weight into the side of my truck, causing it to rock as if it had been slammed by an earthquake. I locked it. Then he snarled and pounded on the window with his fists, thud thud thud, trying to break in, but the glass held tight. Then another truck arrived. I knew I couldn't waste any more time, so I drove out of there with all my might. The maniac didn't follow, but instead watched me drive away with an expression that seemed to say this wouldn't be the last time our paths would cross. As I pulled into the rest stop, the headlights illuminated a face so twisted with evil intent that it still burns into my memory to this day. Cross, and now, as I travel through an unknown area after midnight, my worst fears are beginning to come true. I kept traveling towards Denver because I couldn't let the idea of the maniac stop me. One gloomy night, I saw another trucker at a busy rest area. Taking a chance, I went up to him and told him my story, and to my surprise, he had heard of similar encounters in the area. He claimed the man was supposed to be Hank Carver, a former truck driver who, because of his violent tendencies, lost both his job and eventually his family. Carver's anger had consumed him, turning him into a relentless predator who now preyed on truckers at remote rest stops. There had been numerous horrific incidents, publicized nationwide, and I was aware that Carver might still be pursuing me. I chose not to call for assistance, since doing so would mean stopping exactly what Hank Carver desired. Instead, I faced reality and realized that this antagonist was no longer merely a theoretical idea, was bone and flesh in front of me as I battled fatigue while driving into the night. And anxiety, I realized that I had to face my tormentor because death was close by. In any event, a few days after alerting authorities about my intentions and, armed with a strategy, I paused at a peaceful rest spot because Hank was in danger. It only took a few moments for Carver to emerge from beneath the canopy of the darkness that enveloped us, caused our eyes to meet in familiarity, and we refused to back down in the face of malice. Hank's appearance chilled me to the bone. His skin was partially rotted, and decomposing tissue dangled from his exposed bones. Gaping holes, the stale scent of blood on his body mixed with the strong stench he carried buried without time to waste. The subsequent events can only be characterized as Grizzly was bound by ropes that were placed covertly around him while he snuck up on me. Hank futilely tried to escape, but I had deceived him, and now remember all the truckers you've tormented. Hank and damnation would shower down on him, shouted out and gazed down at him while he rode against his restraints. There was no indication of regret or in his view. Humanity had already shriveled in his soul due to dread of revenge. I unleashed my fury on Carver, the man who had shared my profession, but instead decided to hunt and hurt his gullible like he had done to so many others. I viciously attacked the demon brethren. Even though I was furious, I knew that killing him would not be the solution. We were already enveloped by darkness, so I wanted him apprehended and taken to justice. I called 911, no longer afraid, for both myself and the people he had harmed before me. Carver would listen to me and share with them all that had transpired. As when emergency personnel arrived, I kept an eye on Carver's miserable condition. Police quickly surrounded the others after they were thrashing on the ground in front of me. Stop. But when they got closer to us and pulled their weapons out of their holsters, suddenly, a dense fog cloud covered the area, making it impossible to see anything. Hank Carver vanished like a ghost in an instant, and the officers searched in vain and came back empty-handed, relieved that he was absent, but I was uneasy about how quickly it had occurred, so I thanked the officers for their assistance. Then, went back to my rig to continue the adventure. Hank Carver vanished that evening into the thick fog close to a distant truck stop on an unending route that will be haunting, remain engraved in my memory for all time. Traversing a perilous route between sanity and madness battles the dark side of our trade every night while driving. Where monsters breed mayhem, there is nighttime murder, and Hank Carver has demonstrated how the path draws these sole survivors who are steadfastly bound to their pasts, and as long as trucks continue to travel these routes, the victims will be dotted throughout this desolate area and become part of its history, stretched like clay that is more brittle than they thought as I drive forward. The countless evenings their tales haunt me leave me feeling shivering, sensation that is difficult to get rid of, and the information is ingrained deep within of me that Hank Carver is waiting for another opportunity somewhere along these winding roadways. Hit.